Alex, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Rob, how are you? Thank you for having me today.
I'm doing pretty good. I'm pretty excited about having this episode. So, Alex, last time we were chatting last week, we had a great conversation about leadership buy-in and some of the things that you need to do when you're trying to get management on side with a lot of the new initiatives that you're bringing to the table. Um, so I want to dive into a lot of that today. Where do you think when it comes to getting leadership buy-in, security leaders, what are some of the things that they need to start doing?
I thought about this actually quite a bit because I think at least every time I go to any type of event or I hear a talk, it really is about, you know, leadership buy-in. And I think there's universal agreement that it's necessary, right? But when I really started to think about what is leadership buy-in, some interesting things started to happen for me as far as how do you kind of encapsulate that or capture what that is. From a breakdown perspective, I thought that maybe I would share what I think it is, and ultimately the byproduct or end results of what it actually means. And what I mean by that is, I think leadership buy-in is absolutely essential, but the type of buy-in, the degree of buy-in, the level of buy-in, I think all of those things really play a major role in ultimately this concept of leadership buy-in. I also did a little bit of just research on my own in trying to formulate more of this concept, even for myself as we went through this talk, because I want to make sure to keep this conversation interesting too for all of your listeners. I think ultimately leadership buying at the end of the day isn't only just the awareness to leadership and the fact that they have a commitment towards whatever project you're working on or trying to develop. I think really all of the programs that I've been involved in that are incredibly successful, when I really think about it, the leaders that are not only bought in, but they're committed. They're out there, they're endorsing the product, they are championing the idea of what it is that we're trying to get off the ground. And that also speaks to it's very difficult. Leaders are busy, I think, in every organization. Really trying to structure that as far as leadership buy-in is concerned and what that means and knowing what success looks like, I think, is also a very important thing. And I'm happy to share today any of those best practices that hopefully are beneficial for folks that are listening out there. And I know we'll cover this at the end, I think, too, but I'm always happy to have those conversations with any individuals who are going through similar situations as we faced before.
Well, I like that answer, Alex, because I think it gives a good table of contents of where we want to go in this conversation. And I think, like you're trying to say, when you're at a lot of events and hearing about this, I know I hear a lot about the great strategies that company, security leaders want to implement, and how they're going to keep their organization safe or deal with challenges. But at the end of the day, if you're not getting the leadership team involved in that part of the mission, then all the strategies in the world aren't really you're certainly not going to be able to implement it.
That's a great point, and you used a word that's near and dear to my heart, and frankly, that I think is overused a lot of the times is strategy. uh, Even the definition of strategy and how that relates to just the deliverables from a goal setting perspective, right? So I won't intermingle them too much, but in my mind, kind of the analogy there is strategy is also a very specific process, right? And ultimately, I also give a lot of kudos as far as the folks who are really good at strategy and what that means. And ultimately, with leadership buy-in, I treat it in the same way of the concept of leadership buy-in, but then ultimately translate it into some of the end results that I think start to indicate whether or not you're moving the dial on your project, right? And I'll give you an example here. We started to deploy, and I know this is a conversation that I've had with a lot of my peers within the industry, is how do you get your audience or your employees or your kind of group that you're really after to adopt, let's say, a product. And here, that is something that when we really started looking at how to integrate those pieces, leadership buy-in started to become even more critical, because you actually also realize the power of an executive saying something and the natural buy-in of really the folks that are on those teams. And so part of our layering started to become, how do we use that positioning and as a conduit towards this bigger kind of adoption that we were after. And those things really help. They significantly help. Nothing is a better sponsor for your product or the initiative that you have than having a leader say, not only do I believe in this product, but here's the end result, why we're doing it, what it's going to lead to. And I'll tell you something else that kind of naturally occurred with that. There's so much positivity and energy amongst the team when that is happening. When the team really feels that what they're the time they're investing and what they're building is really resonating at those levels, it almost is one of those kind of self-feeding cycles of, now I want to do it even more and try even harder type of deal. So um, anyway, that's what I think of when you say strategy as well, because I think these things are notions that I'm glad we get an opportunity like this to dive a little deeper into. I hope that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I'd be curious to kind of hear from your experiences. And I know in the security industry, this is a tough question to ask because everyone has to be cagey with specifics. But do you have any examples from past projects or work that you've done where once you managed to get that leadership team involved, that you really saw that how this made a difference during the implementation process?
Well, that's a great question. Like with anything that I answer, typically I'd like to reference it to it as layers, in the sense of when I hear a question like that, for me, it's more about, because I think this all also falls under the umbrella of leadership buy-in, which is you also have to have an initiative that is continuously evolving and adapting to actually be successful. And so any if when I think of any of the platforms that we have adopted or that we integrate, that we're consistently benchmarking against, what I think about is, how do we equip and provide a scenario where it's easy for the leader to sell, right? Because it works. And I think that's a real critical portion to this too. Um, I would say, when you recognize that the product is not necessarily yielding the results you think it should, when the feedback isn't an overwhelming, you're on the right track, then definitely need to consider how to adjust and what needs to be adjusted as well, because those are all very important pieces that I think really lead to the end result of having maybe what we'll coin ultimate leadership buy-in or holistic leadership buy-in. I hope that makes
Well,
sense or it answers your question.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. How about then we've kind of I think we've kind of covered a lot of the benefits now of getting leadership buy-in. I think where I'd love to get into now is just really getting to the specifics that comes from the experience that you've had now with I believe over like 17 years. I think I saw on your LinkedIn profile working in the private sector. Has it been that long?
Wow, hearing that out loud really does something to me. Yes, 17 years is what I'm going on here at the Walt Disney Company, which is, I guess, crazy to say out loud for me.
Yeah. So let's tap into a little bit of that experience then. What are some of the best practices that you've learned over the years to get leadership buy-in when you're trying to bring on a new product or start a new project?
Well, that's a great point. I think some of the best practices that come to mind immediately is, I'll tie it into the previous statement that I was making in regards to having a product that is hitting the mark. And that hitting the mark also expands in my mind to the concept of it being aligned with organizational goals, it actually accomplishing and being clear and concise around what it's trying to do. When that happens, what I see is folks can also adopt it and figure out how to use it with their own program and organization. You can imagine how big of a scope we have and the different layers that exist at our company. So, the more we refine that definition and what it's trying to do, the more adoption and acceptance we get because it's very clear from the onset, hey, this is what we are. And to what you're asking, also, this is what we're not. That's just as important. And I think when leaders understand that and they agree with that and they know that it will deliver on the back end, the sky's the limit, as they say. Or maybe I'll quote Walt to say, if you can dream it, you can do it around here.
We gotta include the Disney branding at some point in the podcast.
Right.
So just to make sure I got your answer right, I just want to summarize it. The two big things that you see when trying to implement a new product is make sure that you have a very clear goal and that the product is accomplishing that goal that you stated it to be, and that it's very easy for everyone in the organization to adopt, to kind of minimize the friction that might come up in making some sort of change. Is that a good summary of what you said?
It is. It's a good summary. And the recap, I would add a third layer, which is documentation, documentation, documentation. I know that's pretty universal, but having a product and that layout also serves a, I think, valuable purpose around quickly being able to get folks on board with what it is that you're trying to do. And it also, what I have found over the years, positions conversations differently from the onset because you're working off, let's say, getting on the same sheet of music type of idea, right? Where you actually have a product that it makes it easier to say, okay, I understand it, or maybe how do we adjust this or adjust that to make it more acceptable, so to say.
Gotcha. What might be some of the common mistakes, perhaps that you've run into or that you've seen other securities run into when they've been trying to get leadership buy-in to a new initiative?
My gut is telling me the answer for this question in my mind is more around assumptions. Assumptions that folks understand what you're talking about and understand what the true goal of your program is. And I think that is really related to that initial concept of clarity and the foundation that you're trying to build. That foundation is very critical to alignment. So I think one of the biggest pitfalls is, and I think maybe because I'm such a aficionado maybe of sociology, psychology, I'm always fascinated in how folks understand and interpret. So it's really benefited me in this industry as well, as far as some of that education, because the best way I've heard it coined is it's the coat you wear. And so I think when it comes to pitfalls, the assumptions that I'm referencing is more around the fact that we're starting from a, especially in the security industry, we're starting from a point where we kind of have the same value set or meaning to certain things. And that's not necessarily always the case. It very much varies in between that. And so a best practice for me is to level set that at the beginning of here's what we're up against. And walking away, and I think if I can speak just to another best practice, at least that we implement here, is that last layer of making sure we're on the same page. Let me recap this for a minute. It's so valuable. I know it. And it's really, at the end of the day, I recently read a book that was passed on to me about how to engage and get more of that leadership buy-in. And the long and short of it is these concepts are very basic, but they're so important, I think. And it's very easy in the day-to-day operation and responsibility to get lost in the fact that, okay, yeah, I'm going to take that for I'm going to take that as a given, right? But when we talk about this specific question, I think that some of the pitfalls are those assumptions and maybe thinking that within that you're operating off of just the same foundation. And so we like to make sure that both at the beginning and the check-ins during the conversation and at the end we have an agreement of what that is. And I think that ultimately leads into getting a leader to really buy into the product that you're out there trying to advocate for.
What would be that's a really interesting answer there, Alex. I'd be really curious to hear like maybe some examples, things that you've run into, or things that maybe colleagues in the business where they've kind of made assumptions about what leadership might already know and believe, but then it kind of turned out wrong at the end of the day. Like where do you think those things that you could trip up?
Uh, You know what? I'll use two come to mind. And forgive me here because these are on the fly because one of them happened as recently as today. But I'll kind of give you an example of where I think it worked out very well and an example of where I think there was some more work to do. And specifically within the control centers, we are very technology heavy. And so we're always in that position of having to take kind of these complexities of what these platforms actually deliver. And not only that, but identifying that out of, the 3,000 feature sets, we're only going to use, these four, right? But then taking that and like, what do we use them for? What's the benefit? And so on and so on. That's pretty normal. Where I've seen those things really turn out as far as expectation, kind of to your question, to end result is, and maybe this is why I reference so much the assumptions and making sure we're on the same page, because I remember specifically one of the items where we were having a new line, a new business line come on board, and we were having these conversations around what it means to do our mapping and our dispatching and ultimately these other layers that we use within the control center. And it was a pretty straightforward concept and everybody was on the same page. What we never really got, though, to some of the considerations that people just assume were going to be part of these packages, right? And so when we go and say, hey, listen, the same suite of services and how we're going to deliver, all of a sudden these considerations are coming at us that are like, hey, wait, we never thought about this and that. So now, as a result of that, when we have an upfront piece where we're doing in that similar situation of just aligning expectations so we know from beginning to end, we start with more of that check sheet and checklist of here's the suite of services and the offerings. Ultimately, how does that align? But more importantly, what's unique to your business? Because inevitably, everybody has a very unique piece to their business. And so without going into too much detail, that's one of the experiences that we had that really was a catalyst for best practice on the front end of that alignment piece. Like, let's make sure we're tacking, as they say, apples to apples and not apples to pears or oranges. Now, where I see that it works extremely well, having implemented some of those practices, and also I think in this industry, and for all of your listeners, I'm sure we can relate. Everybody talks about how we're building the plane as we fly it, because a lot of the times we're in these dynamic situations that call for this ingenuity or this evolution. And with the scale that we deal with, I feel like that's happening all the time. One of the best ways to phrase it is I had the privilege of attending one of the leaders here, and the way he couched it is we're never done with films, but we have to release them. And I kind of feel like it's the same landscape that we're in, where we're never done with a process or a project, but we have to release a version of it. But one of the recent things, and I didn't plan this, but today we actually received a very complimentary email as an end result. And what ended up happening, just to set up the email with a little bit of background context, we've been exploring some additional layers within our current mass communication system around how we can real provide more of that real time update and that type of assistance where one of the things that plagues the communication industry, especially in security as a whole, I think, is the latency. How quickly can you get something out? How quickly can you get those questions answered? And this is a process that at least I've been thinking about for, I guess, now 17 years as we started off, because it is always a challenge. Recently we started adopting and integrating more of this real time, not only situational awareness, but that communication and that raw data. And although we still have some of the challenges of dealing with things like validation and confirmation of what is going on, I found that it really opened up that instantaneous feel of at least I know what's happening supersedes anything else because you're dealing with folks also that are in your industry and kind of understand those concepts. So the long and short of it though, when we implemented this process and we didn't have time to go through the check the, box items of we got to get people educated on board online. And this is where I go back to I use a lot in our department the saying of if you build it, they will come from that classic movie, right? Because I do believe that if your product, if your process, if your project is serving a purpose is good, then you will naturally have clients and partners that gravitate towards it. And so as part of this initiative with releasing not only the real-time distribution but ingest of that information and how we triage, it became this very fluid situation and it was dynamic both in both ways. We were having that immediate, we were able to address questions. We had a traveler who was caught up in some of the recent events and just extremely worried like anybody would be. And today it culminates with a wonderful email of just how safe and how grateful it was for us to be able to support in that way. And so you really see some amazing results. And I can't speak for anybody but myself, but I will say that when we get an email here that somebody takes the time to craft, but more so, this was a very lengthy thank you. And listen, I'll take it all day. The longer, the better, right? But I think it really just reinforces why we do what we do. And a lot of that I say short and sweet, is related to, not only how we handle the projects, but the leadership buy-in, their advocacy out there, and ultimately how we take that product from an idea into implementation. And it's never a straight line, by the way, right? Like they say, it's always, and every project takes on that difference. But once you have that fundamental and that leadership buy-in piece, I think you can do some great things.
Yeah. That's a great answer there, Alex. I appreciated that you managed to get two movie analogies, which I wouldn't expect anything less from a guy working at Disney Studios. But I love the examples that you're able to provide there because I think there's a lot of value in those, and sometimes maybe some people are like nodding their head and saying, "Yeah, I've been in that situation before," or it's some potential examples of, "Hey, people that those are the minds that people might be able to miss." Uh, just by listening to other examples that you provided there. I kind of want to go into the direction now. You talked about getting leadership buy-in for a potential new project, and then in the implementation. Are there any challenges that come when trying to maintain leadership buy-in after a project or product has already been implemented?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's several things that become challenges. And um, I think those challenges also, dare I say, are a good indicator of how much leadership buy-in you potentially have. So one of the interesting things is, as much as we talk about the benefits of leadership buy-in, there is absolutely a substantial feel of the drawbacks with not having leadership buy-in. And a lot of times I will say that, listen, I'm very grateful for the position that I'm in because I think you work with some of the best people in the world, I think. And ultimately, the reason for me saying that is because anything that I talk about of challenges and drawbacks has more to do with a natural byproduct. It's not intentional, is really my point. At least not from what I see. Seldomly do you see that an intentional and more so a byproduct of just natural occurrences, really. And so, how it really gets back into the drawbacks, I would actually use those as indicators to say, do I really have leadership buy-in? The type of
Mhm.
leadership buy-in that is it. As an example, what came to mind as soon as you asked that question is resources. One of the hardest things in the security industry as a whole, I think, are resources because they take a lot of time and commitment justification, kind of where are you going to get all that from? So when a leader is willing to back that and advocate and champion and resource, it's great. So if you find yourself in that position, in the position of really, are you being allocated anything additional? And those can come in different ways, right? Whether it's monetary, whether it's personnel, access to certain platforms, whatever it is. If that layer is questionable, or let's say needs to be explored, I think that's a good indicator of maybe, do you continue to evolve the basis or the objective of what that is? Because when you do have leadership buy-in, and I think everybody's also experienced, there really is like, okay, we're going to move forward, and what buildings do we have to move? What do we have to do to make sure that it gets done, right? From a priority perspective. So it's kind of my first shot at the question you just asked as far as drawbacks.
Gotcha. Alex, really enjoyed the conversation today. Coming up on all the time I promised to take from you. What's the one takeaway you want listeners to remember from our conversation?
Oh, that's such a great question. Such a great question. I guess at the end of the day, if anybody were to walk away with anything on leadership buy in, is that maybe it comes down to a very simple question of, is there anything else I need to do to ensure not only that I have your support, but anything that needs to be done in order to gain that full potential of what that is? And I think that sets the platform for just a great conversation. And hopefully, if it's genuine enough, and if you have, and we can, I'm sure, have a whole different discourse around the trust that's already pre-built. And I think a lot of this is also driven by your brand and ultimately how you place yourself within that organization. But I'd say that is just that check in and that open feeling of inviting those questions. I think a lot of the times those things are assumed, or maybe they don't get discussed as much as they should be. But I also understand everything's a balance. So hopefully that kind of culminates what I think about leadership buy-in. But if I can say anything to anyone walking away, is it's always good to check in and ask where you are currently in that, let's say, sphere, so to say.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the conversation today. And how can listeners get in touch if they want to learn more about your work?
Thanks for asking that. We are always open to benchmarks, conversations, and so they are free to email me. It's just my name at disney.com, um, and my name with a dot, obviously after Alex, but then at disney.com. And I'm sure I'd be happy to get back to anybody who's interested in having a follow up conversation. I think that's the easiest way.
All right, Alex, I'll be sure to include that in the show notes if listeners want to reach out. But thanks again for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob, for having me. Really appreciate it.